My ex-wife's mother called the cops on me, not knowing I owned the house. Why did his former mother-in-law believe she had the right to call the police on him? What would happen when the officers learned who legally owned the property? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Six Store, where family conflict, false assumptions, and surprising truths lead to unforgettable consequences. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic story. Thank you for every view, thoughtful comment, and moment you spend watching with us. Your support helps this community continue growing stronger each day. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. We genuinely appreciate everyone joining us from different countries and cities. Now, settle in, follow every detail carefully, and let us step into the opening scene of today's remarkable story. Sir, before you step any further, I need to know one thing. Are you the owner of this house? The officer's flashlight moved across the hardwood floor, across the family photos still hanging on the walls, and finally stopped on me. For a moment, nobody spoke. Not my ex-wife, not her mother, not even the two officers standing at my front door. Then Patricia Collins smiled. A small, confident smile. The kind of smile people wear when they believe they already won. He doesn't own anything here, she said. He's my daughter's ex-husband. He's not supposed to be inside. Those words hung in the air longer than they should have. Not because they hurt. I had heard worse. But because I was standing in the living room I designed myself. The same room where I spent months choosing the wood, measuring the walls, and building a place I thought would one day hold a lifetime of memories. And now, after everything, I was being treated like a stranger breaking into my own home. I looked around slowly. The same fireplace where Rachel and I drank coffee every Sunday morning. The same staircase where we carried boxes on moving day 15 years earlier. The same walls that held pictures of a marriage everyone thought would last forever. Funny how a place can remember everything, even when people don't. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old. And for most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard, kept your promises, and took care of the people you loved, things would eventually work out. I wasn't born wealthy. I didn't inherit a company. I wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room expecting people to notice him. I was the man behind the scenes. The one who woke up before sunrise, grabbed a cup of coffee, and spent 12 hours making sure everyone else's plans became reality. That was how I built my construction business. One project at a time, one handshake at a time. And that was how I built this house. Not just with money, with pieces of my life. Rachel used to say this place was proof that we made it. Back then, she would stand in the empty living room with paint samples in her hand and imagine where our future children would play. She would talk about holidays, family dinners, and growing old together. I believed every word. Because when you love someone, you don't question the foundation. You trust it. But foundations can crack quietly, long before anyone notices the damage. Our marriage didn't end with one huge explosion. There wasn't one dramatic moment where everything collapsed. It was smaller things. The conversations that became shorter. The smiles that became forced. The feeling that I was standing next to someone who was slowly walking away. By the time Rachel asked for a divorce, she had already convinced herself of a story. A story where she was the one who deserved a better life. And I was the man who had somehow failed to give it to her. Her mother, Patricia, agreed with every word. She never liked the quiet life Rachel and I built. She wanted luxury, status, and a family name people recognized. To her, I was just a man who worked with his hands. Someone useful, but not impressive. After the divorce, I didn't fight for attention. I didn't stand outside Rachel's house begging her to reconsider. I didn't tell everyone my side of the story. I simply walked away. At least, that was what they thought. They believed I had lost my home. They believed I had lost my place. They believed I had nothing left. And for 2 years, I let them believe it. Until today. Until Patricia called the police. Until she pointed at me and told strangers I didn't belong here. The officer looked back at the folder in my hand. Sir, he asked again, do you have proof of ownership? I lowered my eyes for a second. Then I opened the folder. Because after 2 years of silence, I knew one thing. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be revealed. The hardest part wasn't losing the house. It was realizing the people I built it with had already decided I never belonged there. 2 years before the police showed up at my front door, I was standing in the same kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, watching the woman I loved tell me she wanted a different life. Rachel sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a mug she barely touched. The morning sunlight came through the windows, the same windows we picked together when we designed the house. But that day, the room felt colder than it ever had. "I think we both know this isn't working anymore," she said quietly. Those words were gentle, almost careful, but sometimes the quietest words leave the deepest cuts. I remember looking around that kitchen and seeing every memory at once. The first dinner we cooked after moving in. The nights we stayed up late discussing plans. The weekends where we walked through empty rooms and imagined a future that hadn't happened yet. I had spent years believing I was building a home. I didn't realize Rachel had already started thinking of it as something else. An asset, a possession, a symbol of the life she wanted after she decided I wasn't part of it anymore. Our problems didn't appear overnight. That would have been easier. A betrayal you can see is something you can fight. But slow distance is different. It arrives quietly. A conversation that lasts 5 minutes instead of an hour. A dinner where two people sit at the same table but live in completely different worlds. A wife who stops asking how your day was because she already stopped caring about the answer. Rachel wasn't a bad person when we met. That's the part people never understand. Most relationships don't begin with villains. They begin with two people who believe they are building something permanent. When I met Rachel, she was ambitious, intelligent, and full of energy. She made me laugh when life was difficult. She believed in my dreams before anyone else did. I still remember the first time I showed her the empty piece of land where the house would eventually stand. There was nothing there, just dirt, wind, and a vision. She looked at me and said, "I can actually see it." And I believed her. I believed she could see the same future I saw. A family, a place where our children could grow up, a home that would outlast us. But somewhere along the way, the future we imagined became two different futures. Rachel started comparing our life to other people's lives. She noticed bigger houses, more expensive cars, vacations we didn't take, neighbors who seemed to have everything figured out. And slowly, what we had stopped being enough. Patricia, her mother, didn't help. She had always believed Rachel deserved more. More money, more status, more attention. To Patricia, a man like me was dependable, but ordinary. She respected success more than character. And after the divorce conversation started, she became the voice Rachel listened to the most. "You're too young to settle," Patricia told her. I heard that sentence once, but I felt the meaning behind it 100 times. I wasn't a husband anymore in their eyes. I was an obstacle. When the divorce papers were finalized, Rachel expected me to fight over the house. She expected anger, arguments, a long battle, but I didn't give her that. I signed what needed to be signed. I packed what was mine, and I walked away. People misunderstood that. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought leaving quietly meant losing. But I had learned something over the years. Not every battle is won by being the loudest person in the room. Sometimes, the person who stays calm is the only one who knows the whole truth. Rachel moved back into the house. Patricia started visiting more often. And eventually, the story changed. Neighbors heard that Ethan Walker had lost everything. Friends heard that Rachel had finally escaped a life that was holding her back. Nobody asked me what happened. Nobody wanted the complicated version. They wanted the simple one. The one where Rachel was the winner, and I was the man who walked away empty-handed. And I let them believe it. Because I knew something they didn't. The house was never Rachel's to take. The divorce had ended our marriage. But it never changed the name on the ownership documents. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to embarrass her. I stayed quiet because I wanted to see how far people would go when they believed I had nothing left. And 2 years later, Patricia showed me the answer. She didn't just believe I had lost. She believed I was a stranger in the place I built. That was why she called the police. That was why she stood there with confidence. And that was why she had no idea what was inside the folder I was holding. Because sometimes people reveal exactly who they are when they think you have no power left. The moment I realized they weren't afraid of losing me was the moment I understood they had never really valued what I gave them. When I walked away from that house 2 years earlier, Rachel thought she had won. At least, that was what she wanted everyone to believe. She told people the divorce was her decision. She told them she had finally chosen herself. She told them I was a man who couldn't keep up with the life she wanted. And maybe the part that bothered me the most wasn't that she said those things. It was how easily people believed them. Because the truth is, people rarely look for the full story. They look for the version that makes the most sense from the outside. And from the outside, Rachel had everything. A beautiful house, a comfortable life, a mother who defended every decision she made. Meanwhile, I was the quiet guy who packed a few boxes and left without a fight. That made it easy for people to assume I had lost. But what they didn't understand was something I learned a long time ago. Walking away from a situation doesn't always mean you were defeated. Sometimes it means you already know the outcome. After the divorce was finalized, I moved into a small apartment. Across town. Nothing impressive. Nothing anyone would take pictures of. Just 4 walls, a small kitchen, and a place where I could finally hear myself think. For the first few weeks, silence was the hardest part. Not because I missed the house. Not because I missed the furniture or the space. I missed the feeling that someone was waiting for me to come home. That's the part nobody tells you about losing a marriage. You don't just lose a person. You lose the routine. The small moments nobody else notices. The sound of someone walking down the hallway. The extra coffee cup on the counter. The simple question at the end of a long day. How was work? Those little things are what make a place feel alive. And when they disappear, even a beautiful house can feel empty. But I refused to let bitterness control me. I kept working. I focused on my company. I rebuilt the parts of myself that had been ignored while I was trying to save something that was already falling apart. Meanwhile, Rachel stayed in the house. And slowly, the story around town changed. People started repeating things they heard from her. He just couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted. She outgrew him. He probably didn't have much choice but to leave. Every sentence was another piece of a story that wasn't mine. But I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. Because sometimes explaining yourself to people who already made up their minds is just another way of giving them control. Patricia seemed to enjoy the attention even more. She had always been protective of Rachel, but after the divorce, she became something else. She became the person who rewrote history. Whenever someone mentioned the house, she would say things like, "Rachel deserves that place after everything she went through." As if I had been some temporary visitor in my own life. As if the years I spent working late nights, making payments, and building that home were just background details. The strange thing about pride is that it can make people blind. Patricia wasn't just convinced she was right. She needed to be right. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting she had judged me without knowing the facts. And some people would rather protect their pride than accept reality. For 2 years, I watched quietly. I watched Rachel replace memories with a new story. I watched Patricia become more confident with every person who believed her. I watched them both settle into the idea that I had lost everything. But what they never asked was one simple question. Why did I leave so easily? Why didn't I fight for the house? Why didn't I argue? Why didn't I try to prove anything? The answer was simple. Because I knew something they didn't. The house was never about who lived inside it. It was about who legally owned it. And while everyone was busy celebrating my supposed defeat, the paperwork never changed. The records never changed. The truth never changed. Then came the morning Patricia decided to take things too far. She called me while I was driving near the property. Her voice wasn't angry. It was confident, almost amused. "Ethan, you need to stop showing up here," she said. I looked at the house through my windshield. The place where I had built my dreams. The place where they believed I no longer belonged. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I replied. But Patricia laughed softly. "No, Ethan. The misunderstanding is that you still think this is your home." That was the moment I knew. She wasn't confused. She wasn't mistaken. She truly believed I had no power left. And that was exactly why she made the call that changed everything. She called the police. And she had no idea she was about to prove my point for me. People think a house is built with bricks, wood, and concrete. But they're wrong. A house is built with sacrifices, and sometimes those sacrifices are the very things people forget first. Before anyone called the police that morning, before Patricia stood at my front door pretending I was a stranger, there was a time when that same house represented everything Rachel and I believed we were building together. And that was the part nobody understood. The house was never just a property. It was a promise. A promise I made long before anyone thought there would be a reason to question who it belonged to. I still remember the first day I saw the land. There was nothing there. No driveway. No walls. No windows looking out into the backyard. Just an empty piece of ground surrounded by trees and an old fence that was barely standing. Most people would have looked at it and seen a difficult project. I saw a future. I saw a place where my family could grow. A place where every room had a purpose. A place where Rachel and I could create the life we always talked about. Back then, Rachel was different. She wasn't the woman who would later stand across from me while her mother called the police. She was the woman who would sit beside me on the unfinished floor, eating takeout from a cardboard box because we couldn't afford a proper dining table yet. She was the woman who would look at the construction plans and say, "One day, we're going to look back at this and be proud." And I believed her. Because when someone you love believes in the same dream, you don't question whether that dream will survive. You simply build. That was what I did. Every morning, I woke up before sunrise. I worked on my business during the day. Then I spent evenings at the property checking progress, solving problems, and making decisions most people never saw. The kitchen layout, the flooring, the lighting, the small details that nobody notices when everything is finished. But those details mattered to me, because every choice carried a piece of my effort. Every corner of that house had a memory attached to it. The staircase where Rachel and I argued about paint colors for an entire weekend. The backyard where we planted our first tree. The front porch where we sat during summer nights and talked about growing old together. At that time, I never imagined that one day someone would point at that same porch and say I didn't belong there. But life changes slowly. Sometimes so slowly that you don't notice the foundation cracking until the entire structure starts falling apart. The same thing happened with my marriage. Rachel didn't wake up one morning and suddenly stop loving me. It happened little by little. A change in priorities. A change in expectations. A change in the way she looked at the life we created. The house that once represented success started becoming something else to her. A measurement. A comparison. A reminder of what she thought we didn't have. And then Patricia entered the picture more than ever. Her mother saw the world differently than I did. To Patricia, a person's value was connected to appearances. The neighborhood they lived in. The car they drove. The people who knew their name. She never understood why I was satisfied building something meaningful instead of something impressive. She thought I was too comfortable, too ordinary, too simple for the future Rachel deserved. But what Patricia never understood was that simple does not mean insignificant. Quiet does not mean weak. And a person who doesn't show off does not mean they have nothing. When Rachel finally decided she wanted a divorce, Patricia supported her completely. She believed I would fight. She believed I would become angry. She believed I would reveal desperation. But I didn't. Because there was something they didn't know. Something I never shared during the divorce conversations. Something I kept private because I never thought I would need to use it as proof. The house had a history. A legal history. A history that existed long before Rachel's assumptions. Long before Patricia's confidence. Long before anyone decided I was just a man who had walked away with nothing. The truth was hidden in documents. Documents that had my name on them. Documents that never changed. And maybe that was why I stayed quiet. Because deep down, I wanted to believe the people I once loved would remember the truth without needing me to prove it. I wanted to believe Rachel would never let things go that far. I wanted to believe Patricia would never treat me like an intruder. But people reveal themselves when they think you have no power left. And on that morning, standing outside the house I built, I finally understood something. They weren't testing whether I belonged there. They were about to discover who had belonged there all along. The most dangerous thing about being underestimated is that people stop looking for the truth. For 2 years, Rachel and Patricia believed they knew exactly what happened to me. They believed the divorce had taken everything from me. They believed I walked away from the house because I had no choice. They believed my silence was proof that I had lost. But what they never understood was this. I wasn't silent because I was defeated. I was silent because I was watching. After the divorce papers were signed, I made a decision that surprised everyone. I didn't fight for the house. I didn't argue over furniture. I didn't spend months in court trying to prove how much I had sacrificed. People expected a battle. They expected anger. They expected me to become the bitter ex-husband they could point at and say, "See, this is why leaving him was the right decision." But I refused to become that person. Because sometimes the strongest move you can make is refusing to play a game designed to make you look like the villain. The truth was, I already knew what mattered. The house was protected. The documents were clear. The ownership records had never changed. Rachel knew we lived there together. She knew I was the one who purchased the property before we were married. She knew the legal arrangements. But after the divorce, she started acting like those details didn't matter. And maybe that was the part that hurt the most. Not the separation. Not leaving the place I built. It was watching someone who once knew every sacrifice I made suddenly pretend those sacrifices never happened. I remember one conversation we had during the divorce process. Rachel looked at me across the table and said, "I just want a fresh start." At the time, I thought she meant a fresh start for both of us, a chance to move forward without resentment. But later, I realized she meant something different. She wanted a fresh start without the weight of remembering what I had contributed. She wanted the future without acknowledging the past. And Patricia encouraged that way of thinking. She made sure Rachel believed she was making the right decision. "You're finally choosing yourself," Patricia told her. But what she never asked was who had been standing beside Rachel when things were difficult, who stayed late working to pay for the things they wanted, who repaired problems before anyone noticed them, who carried responsibilities without needing recognition. That person was me. But in their new version of the story, I was just the man who couldn't keep up. A few months after the divorce, I heard that Patricia had started telling people the house was Rachel's victory. She said Rachel had kept the home. She said Rachel deserved it after the difficult years she had endured. The words were strange to hear, because they described a completely different reality than the one I lived. I wasn't angry, at least, not in the way people expected. Anger is easy. Anyone can react emotionally when they feel betrayed. But patience requires something else. It requires accepting that some truths take time to reveal themselves. So I focused on my own life. My business grew. My days became quieter. I started rebuilding the parts of myself I had neglected. And slowly, I realized something important. I didn't miss the house as much as I thought I would. Because a house is just a structure. The memories inside it are what make it valuable. And if the people inside no longer respect those memories, even the most beautiful home becomes empty. But while I moved forward, Rachel and Patricia became more comfortable with their assumptions. They changed the locks. They removed some of my remaining belongings. They stopped asking questions. Every action showed the same belief. They thought I had no connection to that place anymore. They thought I had surrendered. Then one afternoon, I received a call from Patricia. I knew immediately from her tone that something was different. She wasn't calling to discuss anything. She was calling to announce a decision she had already made. "Ethan," she said, "you need to stop coming around the property." I looked at the house from my car window. The sunlight reflected off the same windows I had chosen years ago, the same front door I had installed with my own hands. I took a moment before answering. "Patricia, I think there's been a misunderstanding." She laughed, not loudly, not angrily, almost like she felt sorry for me. "No, Ethan. The misunderstanding is that you still think you have a say there." That sentence told me everything. She wasn't confused about the situation. She was confident. Confident enough to believe she could erase the truth simply by saying it out loud. And that confidence was exactly what led her to make the biggest mistake of her life. Because the next thing she did wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a challenge. She called the police. And she did it believing she was protecting someone else's property, not realizing she was about to expose who truly owned it. A person can lie with words. They can lie with confidence. They can even convince an entire room that they are right. But there is one thing that never lies: a document with a name on it. The morning Patricia called the police, she believed she was protecting Rachel. She believed she was finally putting an end to what she saw as my interference. She believed she was standing up for her daughter's home. But what she didn't understand was that she wasn't defending Rachel's property. She was challenging the one thing she never bothered to verify: the truth. I arrived at the house just after sunrise. I wasn't there to start a fight. I wasn't there to create a scene. I simply wanted to collect the last few personal items I had left behind. A few boxes in the storage room. Some old documents from my office. Things that had no value to anyone else, but still carried memories for me. I unlocked the front door with the key I had always used. And for a moment, everything felt normal. The quiet hallway. The familiar smell of the wooden floors. The sunlight coming through the windows. It almost felt like time had stopped. Then I heard footsteps behind me. "Ethan." I turned around. Patricia was standing near the entrance. She wasn't surprised to see me. She was prepared. Behind her was Rachel. And next to them were two police officers. For a second, I thought maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe Patricia had called them because she was worried. Maybe she thought something else was happening. But then she spoke. "Officer, that's the man I told you about." The way she said it made me feel like I wasn't a person. Like I was a problem. A threat. Someone who needed to be removed. Rachel looked away. That hurt more than Patricia's accusation. Because Rachel knew me. She knew the years I spent building that house. She knew the sacrifices. She knew every detail. But she stood there silently. And sometimes silence can say more than words ever could. The officer stepped forward. Sir, can you explain why you're inside this property? I looked at him. Then I looked around the room. The same room where Rachel and I opened wedding gifts. The same room where we celebrated birthdays. The same room where we once believed we would grow old together. I live here, I said calmly. Patricia immediately shook her head. No, he doesn't. Her answer came so quickly that it almost sounded rehearsed. He's my daughter's ex-husband. They're divorced. He has no right to be here. The officer looked at me again. Do you have permission to be on the property? I almost smiled. Permission. That was an interesting word. Because for 2 years, they had been acting like I needed permission to enter something I legally owned. But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to convince anyone with emotions. I had learned something important. When people are committed to believing a lie, explanations rarely change their minds. Evidence does. So I reached into my bag, and I pulled out the folder I had carried with me that morning. The same folder I kept in my office. The same folder I never expected to need for a moment like this. Patricia noticed it, but she didn't look worried. She actually laughed. Ethan, whatever papers you have, they don't change the fact that you're not part of this family anymore. There it was. The real belief behind everything. She wasn't talking about ownership. She was talking about belonging. In her mind, divorce had erased my place in their lives. And because they no longer considered me family, they assumed I had no rights. But property doesn't work that way. Feelings don't rewrite contracts. Opinions don't replace legal records. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were years of history. Purchase agreements. Ownership records. Tax documents. Every piece of paper telling a story they never wanted to hear. The officer watched carefully as I handed him the first page. His expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Because he had seen something they hadn't. A name. My name. He looked at Patricia, then back at the document. And the confidence on her face began to disappear. For the first time that morning, nobody spoke. Because the story they had been telling for 2 years was about to collide with reality. And reality always wins. The room was silent. But the truth had finally entered. For 2 years, Patricia Collins had controlled the story. She told everyone Rachel had kept the house. She told everyone I had walked away because I had nothing left to fight for. She told everyone I was a man who lost everything after the divorce. But in that moment, standing in the living room with the police watching, the story she created started falling apart. The officer held the document in his hands and read carefully. His eyes moved from the page to me. Then back to the page again. Mr. Walker, he said slowly, your name is listed as the primary owner of this property. Nobody moved. Nobody expected those words. Especially Patricia. Her confident expression disappeared almost instantly. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain. That can't be right, she said. Not a question. A denial. The kind of denial people make when reality doesn't match the version they created in their minds. The officer looked at the paperwork again. It appears to be correct. Patricia stepped closer. No, you don't understand. This is my daughter's home. The officer didn't argue. He simply asked the question that changed everything. Ma'am, do you have any documents showing that? Silence. A few seconds earlier, Patricia had been certain I was the person who didn't belong. Now she was the one searching for proof. Rachel stood near the doorway, watching everything unfold. I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw the woman I married years ago. Not the person standing there now. Not the person who allowed this situation to happen. But the person who once sat beside me on an unfinished floor and dreamed about the future. I wondered if she remembered. I wondered if she remembered the nights I stayed awake reviewing construction plans. The weekends I spent fixing problems nobody else knew existed. The years I invested into a place we both called home. Because the truth was never hidden from Rachel. She knew. She knew the land was purchased before our marriage. She knew the ownership arrangements. She knew my name was on the records. But somewhere between the divorce and today, she convinced herself that knowing the truth and accepting the truth were two different things. And that difference changed everything. Rachel, Patricia whispered, turning toward her daughter. Say something. But Rachel didn't answer immediately. Because there was nothing simple she could say. The facts were standing in front of her. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Not the story they had repeated for years. Facts. The officer handed the document back to me. Mr. Walker, based on what I'm seeing, you have every legal right to be here. I nodded. That was it. No celebration. No anger. No dramatic speech. Just the quiet confirmation of something I already knew. But Patricia wasn't finished. People who lose control of a situation rarely accept it immediately. They search for another explanation. Another person to blame. Another reason why the truth should not matter. This doesn't make sense, she said. You left. Her voice became louder. You walked away. I looked at her calmly. Yes. I left. The room became quiet again. But leaving a place doesn't mean losing ownership of it. Those words hit differently, because that was the misunderstanding behind everything. They confused my silence with surrender. They confused my absence with weakness. They thought because I wasn't standing there demanding recognition, I didn't deserve it. But I never needed to announce what belonged to me. The records already said it. Rachel finally spoke. Ethan, why didn't you tell us? I looked at her, and that question stayed with me. Because the answer was complicated. I could have told them. I could have reminded Rachel during the divorce. I could have shown Patricia the paperwork months ago. I could have stopped the rumors before they spread. But I didn't. Because I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I simply believed the truth would eventually find its way back. I didn't think I needed to prove something you already knew, I said. Rachel lowered her eyes. And for the first time, I saw something different. Not anger. Not confidence. Regret. Because the painful part wasn't that they misunderstood the paperwork. The painful part was that they misunderstood me. They saw a man who walked away and assumed he had nothing. They never considered that maybe he walked away because he had nothing left to prove. Patricia looked around the room. The same room where she once believed she had all the power. But power built on assumptions doesn't last. Eventually, reality walks through the door. And when it does, everyone has to face what they ignored. That morning, the police were called because Patricia thought I was an intruder. But by the time they left, everyone understood the same thing. The only person who didn't belong in the story they created was the story itself. The house was never the thing I wanted to win. What I wanted was to know whether the people inside it still remembered who I was. After the police left that morning, the silence inside the house felt different. Not peaceful, not comfortable, different. Because for the first time in years, nobody could hide behind assumptions anymore. Patricia didn't say much after the officers walked away. The confidence she carried when she called them was gone. The certainty in her voice had disappeared. She had expected me to leave embarrassed. She had expected me to explain myself. She had expected the officers to remove me from the property. Instead, she was left standing in the same living room where she had accused me of being an outsider. And now she had to face the truth. I wasn't a stranger. I was the person who built the place she was trying to take away from me. Rachel stayed behind after her mother left the room. For a while, neither of us spoke. There are moments when words feel too small. Moments when everything you could say has already been proven by what happened. Finally, Rachel looked at me. I didn't know you were still the owner. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was painful. You knew, I said quietly. She looked away. And that reaction told me everything. She knew enough. Maybe she didn't remember every detail. Maybe she convinced herself the divorce changed everything. Maybe she listened to Patricia's version of events until it became easier to believe. But deep down, she knew. She knew I had purchased the property. She knew I had built the house before our marriage. She knew the legal documents existed. The problem was never information. The problem was acceptance. Rachel had accepted a version of reality where I was the person who lost. And when someone becomes attached to that version, the truth can feel like an attack. I thought you left because you didn't want the house, she said. I looked around the room. The walls were still the same. The fireplace was still there. The memories were still there. But everything felt different now. I left because I didn't want to fight with someone I once loved, I answered. That was the truth. I could have made the divorce ugly. I could have forced everyone to acknowledge every sacrifice I made. I could have reminded Rachel and Patricia about every payment, every repair, every long night. But what would that have changed? A person who only respects you when you prove your value never truly respected you. And that was the hardest lesson I learned. For years, I thought protecting the people you love meant constantly proving your commitment. I thought if I worked harder, gave more, and stayed patient, people would always recognize your effort. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes people only see your value after they believe they have lost it. Patricia eventually came back into the room. Her attitude had changed. Not completely. People don't transform in a few minutes. But the certainty was gone. "Ethan," she said, "I think this got out of hand." I looked at her. That sentence was interesting, because it suggested this was just a misunderstanding. A small mistake. Something that happened accidentally. But it wasn't accidental. She didn't misunderstand because she lacked information. She misunderstood because she never bothered to ask. She made a decision about who I was before she ever looked at the facts. And that was the part that mattered. The house was only the evidence. The real damage happened long before that morning. It happened every time my efforts were ignored. Every time my silence was mistaken for weakness. Every time someone decided I was less valuable because I wasn't the loudest person in the room. "I'm not angry that you called the police," I told her. Patricia looked surprised. "I'm angry that you believed you were right without ever asking if you were." She had no answer. Because there wasn't one. The truth was sitting between us. And nobody could rewrite it anymore. A few days later, I made a decision about the house. Not because Patricia forced me. Not because Rachel expected it. But because I finally understood something. A home is not defined by who has the keys. It is defined by who feels at peace inside it. And after everything that happened, I knew I couldn't look at those walls the same way again. The house represented a chapter of my life that was already finished. The marriage was over. The dream Rachel and I built together was over. But my future wasn't. I had spent years building that house. Now it was time to build something else. A life where I didn't have to prove I belonged. A life where my worth wasn't determined by whether other people recognized it. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't making people regret underestimating you. Sometimes the greatest victory is realizing you no longer need their approval at all. The day I walked away from that house for the final time, I expected to feel something. Sadness, anger, maybe even regret. But what I felt was something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. A few months after Patricia called the police, I stood in the driveway one last time. The house looked exactly the same. The same windows. The same front porch. The same walls that once held the happiest moments of my life. But I was different. And sometimes, that is the hardest truth to accept. Places don't change. People do. For years, I believed that keeping the house meant protecting the memories. I thought holding on to the property meant holding on to the life Rachel and I once imagined. But after everything that happened, I finally understood something. The house was never the dream. The dream was the people inside it. And when those people no longer saw your value, the walls became nothing more than walls. After the police incident, things between Rachel and me changed completely. Not because we suddenly became friends again. Not because one moment fixed years of damage. Some things cannot be repaired that easily. But because the illusion was gone. Rachel could no longer pretend she didn't know the truth. Patricia could no longer pretend I was someone who had nothing. The version of me they created had disappeared. And what remained was the reality they had avoided. I was never the man who lost everything. I was the man who walked away from something I no longer wanted to fight for. Rachel reached out a few weeks later. She wanted to talk. Not about the house. Not about the documents. About us. About what happened. We met at a small coffee shop across town. A place with no memories attached to it. No history. No expectations. Just two people sitting across from each other, trying to understand how they became strangers after sharing 15 years together. "I was wrong about you," she finally said. Those words were simple, but they carried a weight I never expected. Because for so long, I didn't want an apology. I wanted understanding. I wanted someone to recognize that my silence was never weakness. That my patience was never a lack of confidence. That walking away was not the same as giving up. I looked at Rachel and realized something. She wasn't the only person who needed to learn a lesson. I did too. I learned that love cannot survive when only one person is protecting it. I learned that loyalty means nothing if the other person only values you when you are useful. And most importantly, I learned that your worth cannot depend on someone else's ability to see it. As for the house, I made my decision. I sold it. Some people thought that was surprising. They thought I should keep it. They thought I should make Rachel and Patricia live with the fact that I owned it. They thought the ultimate revenge would be keeping the one thing they wanted. But revenge was never what I wanted. Because revenge keeps you connected to the people who hurt you. And I was ready to move forward. The day the new owners received the keys, I stood outside and watched another family walk through the front door. They smiled. They looked around with excitement. They imagined their own future inside those walls. And strangely enough, That made me happy. Because maybe that was the purpose of that house all along. Not to remind me of what I lost, but to remind me of what I was capable of building. I built that house once. I could build again. A new home. A new chapter. A new life. Years ago, Patricia called the police because she believed I was someone who didn't belong. She thought she was protecting something that wasn't hers. But in the end, she taught me the most valuable lesson. You can lose a relationship. You can lose a place. You can lose the version of yourself that existed before everything changed. But you don't lose your worth. Not if you know who you are. Looking back now, I don't remember the sound of the police arriving. I don't remember Patricia's accusations. I don't remember the moment they thought they had power over me. What I remember is the moment I finally stopped trying to prove myself to people who had already decided who they wanted me to be. Because the greatest victory was never showing them that I owned the house. The greatest victory was realizing I owned my future. And no one could take that away from me.